scientists and other. My name is Dr. Megan Ribbons, and today we will be making delicious hard cider. The first thing you want to do when you're making hard cider is gather your materials. So you'll see I have a funnel that's optional. I'll explain why in a second. An airlock, which includes this rubber stopper, this thing, that thing, and also this thing. Those are all technical terms. Probably a tablespoon, some sort of measuring cup. I like the ones with the lip, and again, and I'll explain that in a bit. You'll for sure need some sort of jug. This is a half-gallon jug, in case that wasn't obvious, in which to do your primary fermentation. Don't worry, I'll explain that. The other thing you're going to need is, for sure, some way to sterilize all of this. Now, I say sterilize in a pretty loose way at this point because this will clean these pretty well, so there's not a lot that will contaminate your inoculation. There'll probably be some cell or other, because we're not autoclaving or doing any other form of sterilization in a pretty serious way. That being said, you'll inoculate with a high enough cell density that your yeasts are probably going to outcompete whatever happened to get in there. So for sure, you'll need this. You might want some yeast nutrient. I'll be honest, I haven't noticed much of a difference with or without it, but it's nice to have. If you're using cider, especially if it's pressed cider, that's, you know, even cider you pressed yourself, you might want to get pactic acid enzyme. It's also called pectinase. That will break down some of the apple sugars into sugar that's more easily digested by the yeast. Especially if you don't need to do this if you're buying store-bought cider, but for sure if you're using cider that you pressed yourself, you'll want something like potassium metabisulfite, sulfite, that will kill wild yeast to put in your cider. It has instructions. And finally, you'll want yeast, and I'll tell you what to do with that in a second. The first thing you want to do is just put water, fill it up, make sure every surface that's going to touch anything that goes into your fermentation is sterilized. So you put water in all of it, you follow the easy clean instructions, or whatever equivalent you've got. There's all kinds of stuff, not just easy clean. There's iodine, there's whatever you'd like. I don't need to tell you how to read, so just follow the instructions and come back to me when all your stuff is sterilized. Okay, so now that you've got everything sterilized, do your best to not touch stuff, you know, like the inside of stuff that's actually going to be touched by your yeast, or touched by the media that's going to go with the yeast. Treat it as sterile. You don't have to wear gloves or anything, but don't get your mitts everywhere. The first thing you want to do now is measure out your sugar. Here, and I'll tell you why. Here I've got about a half a cup of brown sugar and a half a cup of white sugar. Now I've found through about a year's worth of trial and error that 1 cup of brown and 1 cup of white sugar per gallon tends to work really well for your initial fermentation. The white sugar is sucrose. It's glucose bonded to fructose. So it's really simple and a really easy, quick energy for the yeast. So it'll get your culture started and nice and dense very quickly. The brown sugar has molasses in it, which has amino acids. So the same way, if we eat some protein, it kind of keeps us going longer. This will kind of keep the yeast going longer, give them sort of more long-term energy. So again, we got a half gallon, so half a cup of white, half a cup of brown. We put our cider. This is actually fresh pressed. I'm not putting in stuff to kill the wild yeast because it's been pasteurized, which has probably effectively killed anything that was growing on those apples. So I'm pouring it into the sugar because, and I'm sure you already know this, it's easier to kind of get the sugar in there if you dissolve it in some liquid first. So not to belabor the point or anything, of course you can always try to put the sugar through a funnel. You'll find that it gets stopped up pretty easily, so I avoid it if at all possible. Alright, so once you've got your sugar and most of your cider in there, you can of course add your pectinase or pectic enzyme as you prefer, stuff to kill your wild yeast, an yeast nutrient that's totally at your discretion, and I probably don't need to show you how to do that. A moment about the yeast. So when you're first starting, again, you're going to want to get a packet of yeast. There are all kinds. They're really easy to find at a homebrew store. We started out with champagne yeast. Incidentally, the species name is Saccharomyces cerevisiae. Cerevisiae means beer or spirits. So it's very similar in some ways to bread yeast, but in fact, evolutionarily, fun fact, bread yeast and brewing yeast actually evolutionarily split off about 1 billion years ago. So bread yeast and brewing yeast are about as related to each other as they are to human beings. In any case, you can use bread yeast, but I don't recommend it because I'm a purist. So it'll have some directions talking about how you reconstitute the yeast. Again, you can read, so I'm not going to tell you how to do that. Once you've gotten started, what I find works really well, because you'll be rebottling this for a secondary fermentation, and you'll get a bunch of little bottles, clearly, from your initial fermentation. I'll try them all, pick the best one. I won't put my face on this, right? I'll pour it into a glass and leave some in the bottle. Whichever one I like the best, I use to inoculate the next batch. Again, we've been doing this for a year, and we've seen a huge improvement in the quality of our cider as a result of this. It's a lot like the way people make sourdough bread, if you're curious. So, yeah, here's the yeast. It's going into our medium. Incidentally, these bottles with the easy caps are great for your secondary fermentation. So the last thing to do is fill it up. A little headspace, sort of the distance between your medium and the top is perfectly okay. I would try to avoid it, because it'll, the more headspace, the more oxygen, which means the yeast aren't fermenting. We kind of want them mostly anoxic so that they'll produce CO2 and ethanol. CO2 will give you those nice effervescent bubbles that you find with hard cider, and ethanol, of course, is delicious. So now that it's full, the last thing you need to do is get your airlock. So you put it in like this, and like that, stick it in there, and then you take some really cheap hard liquor, because it's sterilizing. Anything that falls in here is not gonna live to get in here. Liquor's also nice because you're going for ethanol anyway, so if anything happens to get from the airlock into your brew, yes, it'll sterilize whatever got in there. No, it won't kill you, which is always a good thing, or make you go blind. So you just pour enough in there so it covers the slats, and you'll see what I'm talking about. Now this thing will bob up and down, you'll see it, as the CO2 evolves from your medium. Okay, so this is what your initial fermentation is going to look like after a couple of days. And if you look very closely, you'll see bubbles coming up the sides. I would let this go for at least, just leave it sit someplace cool and ideally dark, we leave it at room temperature. It's not a huge deal. In any case, let it go for at least 2 weeks, and usually the longer the better. Now, I understand your impatience, but if you can hold off for another week or two at least, I think you'll be pleased that you did. So the next step of your cider fermentation will be the secondary fermentation. So you take your initial fermentation, which you've let go for at least a couple of weeks, and pour it into a new bottle. It will probably be some sort of beer bottle or mason jar with some additional sugar. So this will really enhance the flavor and especially the bubbles of your cider. This is where a lot of the effervescence, the making it not still, will come in any case. So with your initial fermentation, you take off the airlock and you pour. Now for the sugar, I found that a good amount is about 3 tablespoons of sugar per 12 ounces, and you can scale up or down accordingly. You'll want to play around with that number, and it doesn't have to be all the same sugar. For example, you could do 2 tablespoons of white and 1 tablespoon of brown. You could use other sugars besides that, and if you think I'm going to tell you what's in ours, you're crazy. We've come up with our secret formula, and you can come up with yours. In any case, you'll see it's really effervescing there. That's lovely. Now once you've capped your secondary fermentation, you'll want to put it in the same place as your initial fermentations, and let it sit for at least 2 weeks, but honestly, the longer the better. We've had secondary fermentation sitting for months, and they just seem to get better. Be careful with adding too much sugar or keeping it in a place that's too warm. You'll get a bottle bomb. Literally, there's so much CO2 evolving that the bottle will burst, and when you open up your cider after drinking, you might have to open it slowly. Just a little food for thought. You cut it, babe? Now that you've poured all your initial fermentation, now that you've rebottled all of it, you're definitely not going to want to use the the tailings, as we call it. You can see it's very sedimentary. In any case, this is a lot of yeast sediment, and you can actually use it to make yeast extract, which is often used in other sort of microbial media, as you'll see if you check out my blog. So all you have to do here to make this, to take this from just sediment that you can't use into yeast extract, is to add a bunch of salt, and if you're feeling ambitious, heat it up to about 55 degrees Celsius. You don't want to go any higher than 55 because that'll inactivate the enzymes that are breaking down the yeast. It's actually a process called autolysis, or autolysis if you prefer, where the yeast sort of degrades itself and breaks apart its own cells. It's kind of gross. In any case, that's really useful. So, you're done. The last step is to wait and be super impatient, and finally open up your cider very slowly and carefully. In fact, I recommend putting your bottle in the fridge before you drink it. The colder a liquid is, the more CO2 can be dissolved in the liquid, and the less will pop out at you. So, look at that. That is lovely and delicious. All right.